All right, my name is Jackie Frazier. I'm a speech pathologist here at Children's, and I've worked in the X and Y clinic since 2008. I'm also the diagnostic coordinator in our department, and I've been here 42 years, so seen a lot of kids. All right, so we're going to take the bullet train through understanding language development and intervention in children with X and Y variations. So for those of you that may be new to this profession, speech pathologists are required to have a master's degree, and we also have the opportunity to get a PhD, a clinical PhD, in order to provide treatment. And its clinical certification by our national governing board is also required. And if you're in a state with licensure, you have to have a license, and this is a state with licensure. So when you're looking for a speech pathologist in whatever community you live in, those are the credentials that they should have. All right, so what do? Well, we treat speech disorders, which are sound disorders, articulation problems, and language disorders, which involve understanding of language, communication, and the use of language for social interaction. All right, so just as a qualifier before we move ahead, communication isn't just words. We get very focused on that with our children because, of course, we want them to be using words, but it also involves eye gaze, facial expression, body language, gestures, interjections, and vocal tone. And for some of our children with X and Y variations, that's a challenge because we know that they are at risk for autism. And so it's not just the words that we have to work on to make them effective communicators, but all these other things potentially. All right, so today our objectives are to look at some key elements in speech-language development, to identify the challenges that we see in children with XY variations, and to discuss the basics of intervention. All right, just as a reminder and as a disclaimer, this is a very broad talk. There are lots of similarities and differences across the spectrum of XY variations in speech-language development and also within each specific diagnosis, okay? So we'll see different types of speech-language problems, different combinations, and different levels of severity. And in some cases, we don't see any speech-language problems, and that's always a good thing. All right, so today we're going to do an overview in three areas: the infant toddler, the preschooler, and the school-age language. And you might think, well, why do we have to talk about the infant toddler? Because the more we are seeing babies, the more we are beginning to realize that we can identify risk factors very early on. Now, the key word is the risk factor. It doesn't mean it turns into a problem, but it does mean that we are going to identify that baby for, to come back and look at that baby again as they age. Now, you all heard that Nicole is now doing a study on this, so hopefully in the years down the road, we're going to have some really, really good, solid data and not just clinical impressions. All right, so we're going to start with our 0 to 24 month population. In our babies, we start to see social development very early on. There's a social smile by about age 1.5 months, sometimes earlier. They're able to localize to familiar voice, so mom comes into the room and says, "How you doing, Johnny?" And they can look straight at her, and that happens by 4 months. By 4 months, so it may happen earlier. They can distinguish angry from friendly voices by 4 to 5 months, and they're able to shift their gaze. So if mom looks away because someone just came into the room, the baby will look where she is looking, all right? And so even at that very, very, very young age, if that's not happening, that's good information for us, right? It's significant that there might be something going on. All right, so here we have just some very, very broad markers. They respond to gestures by 7 to 9 months. Where's mommy? Where's daddy? That's coming very, very early. And recognizing their name in the 9 to 12 month range. All right, As babies progress towards 12 months and beyond, we see a steady increase in their ability to hook words with objects or actions and with pictures. So by 12 months, 12 to 15 months, that should be happening. They begin to grasp increasingly complex commands. So before 12 months, when you say give me, you usually have to put out your hand. After 12 months, you should just be able to say, give me your ball, and they should be able to do it. All right, we get understanding of more and more complex commands. And by 15 months, we have some understanding of yes and no questions. The baby understands that it's a question, it needs an answer. They may not answer correctly. So you say, do you want your juice? They say yes, you give them juice, and they have a tantrum because they didn't want it. But, you know, they're getting this idea, and that begins to develop all the way to 24 months when they are pretty accurate by that point. So by 24 months, what should they understand? 100 to 300 words? There's probably babies that understand more. That's pretty significant, isn't it? It's pretty impressive.
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, yes.
On this age group, if you're able to identify the factors early,
Yes.
do you see that really helps mitigate the problem, or that the problems will happen regardless of?
I don't think we know because we haven't intervened, you know. So we'll see. We'll see. I mean, there's a lot of variables there, but maybe we can save that for a little bit later so we can kind of get through it and then talk about it. But, you know, maybe that baby already has autism. You know, that's the first sign. Maybe it's due to something else. We do have to respect variations in personality. So some babies, their temperament, they just may not be that interested in doing that. They can do it, but, you know, maybe not so much. So there are many, many variables, I think, that can play into this. But certainly in this population, we're much, much more aware of a possible social weakness and looking for it. All right, so very early on, babies have lots of sound production. They're using their vocalization to get attention and other social skills. Making eye contact, again, another social skill. They babble, they point and show by around 9 to 12 months. May use a few words, some don't. It's an average, you know. They're interested in people and they like games, social games like So Big, Peekaboo, and Patty Cake. All right, so in that 12 to 24 month range, they begin to jargon. Jargon sounds like conversation, but it's not. Sometimes parents will say, if I could only understand, I think it's this articulation problem because I just can't understand him, but they're really trying to talk to me. There are entertainers like Jimmy Fallon and the late Robin Williams who could mimic the sound of languages like Russian or, you know, French. But they're not speaking those languages. They're just mimicking the sound, and that's what babies are doing. They're also starting to combine babbling, jargon, words, and gestures. It's a very kind of fluid process, and they flow between all these different skills. So recently I saw a 14-month-old, and she was a wonderful example. I've been working with her, and she was done. So she went to the door, she took her hands, and she banged on the door, and she looked at her mother and babbled something, and then banged on the door again and looked at her mom again and had this tone of, you know, what is she saying? Out. I want out, and I want it soon, right? Or guess what? It's not going to be pretty. I'm going to be on the floor. All right. Babies lose signs and words, and sometimes parents get very worried about that. They used to have it, now they don't have it. It's part of the developmental process. A word that they found important last week isn't important this week, and now it's something new. And so it's not necessarily an area of concern. So by 24 months, they should be using more words than gestures, and they have between 100 to 200 words. You need about 100 words to begin to combine words. It's just a general standard, about 60% nouns, and then you need verbs and prepositions and some other kinds of words to form little phrases. By this point in time, there's speech. We don't have a lot of research on speech development under 24 months. That's really got a lot of children in the study. But what we do have suggests they should have about 9 beginning sounds and about 5 ending sounds. Alrighty, so what do we see in the babies that have XY variations? They're very quiet.
What's the beginning sound and ending sound?
Beginning of the word, end of the word. And that's just an average, so, okay? All right, they're very quiet. Parents report that they don't hear anything. They don't hear cooing, they don't hear babbling, they don't hear jargoning. They sometimes respond selectively to sound, so they may alert to a knock on the door or the cell phone, but not the reverse. May not respond to being called by their name, but you know they hear because they just responded to the knock on the door or the cell phone. You know, so. Very selective. They're slower to develop that word to object picture connection, to break the code, that word goes with something. We see that. Slower to use words, gestures, and signs, and slower to expand that pool. They may have signs of subtle difficulty with social communication that we saw in that 12-month period, but now it's even more pronounced. They may not make eye contact as often, not as interested in personal interaction. They play those social games so big and peekaboo, but they get tired of them really quick. Facial expression may not be as varied, and a reduced use of point and show. Point and show is an interactive gesture, and so it's a big one that we look at in terms of development. So again, it doesn't mean these children aren't social, but there's a difference in the quality and the frequency of their social behavior. It's hard to describe, but when you're with the child, you know it when you see it. There's a qualitative difference. All right, so therapy. Well, therapy's tough to do with babies and toddlers. They are not going to participate in direct intervention. You cannot say to a baby, listen, I notice you're not babbling, so this is how it's going to work. I'm going to babble, and then you're going to babble. It doesn't work that way. So therapy has to be very indirect, and that means the parent's the focus of therapy. You are, not the baby, because we're going to teach you the strategies that you're going to employ with your baby or your toddler all week long to facilitate and manage up their language development. So let's just look at a couple of strategies because we only have 50 minutes. But so one would be trying to build their understanding of words by matching a word to an action or an object that's part of their daily routine. All right, so when you are in the tub with them, when you're not in the tub with them, when they're in the tub and you are with them, and perhaps washing their various body parts, you would label that, okay? And same when dressing, and your clinician will drive this with you and sort of sort out what that stimulation should look like. If you cannot break the code that words go with something, then that delays use of words, right? If you don't understand what words mean, then that productive use of words is going to be delayed as well. You can increase vocalization by repeating back to the child. So you have to really try and catch them when they're vocalizing, vocalize back to them, you reinforce that behavior, and hopefully you'll get more of it. And then there are lots of sound games, et cetera, that your therapist can guide you into playing as well. All right, so development 2 to 5 years. Oh, now we're really on the bullet train. It goes really, really fast. Lots and lots and lots of rapid growth. So by 3 to 4 years, children can link information from sentence to sentence. They can follow simple stories and answer simple questions about them. By age 4, they understand simple why and when questions. And by 5.5, we really see a shift to transitioning to thinking with language. All right, so you can ask them, how are these two things the same, and they can tell you at a very simple level, and they understand really simple figurative language. And children that do not have problems with language do this very automatically. And so I'm going to just tell you a personal story. So my granddaughter was about 4.5, and I take care of her every Friday. So she's at our house, and we were supposed to pick up her brother from school, and we get a call from my son who says Courtney, his wife, my daughter-in-law, is back. She was out of town. She's back early, so she's going to pick up Lyndon. And he says, so you're off the hook. And Acacia picks up her face out of her ice cream bowl and says, and Courtney's on the hook. I mean, just like that. She inferred what that meant. And Courtney's on the hook for picking up Lyndon. It was pretty incredible. So, all right. So by age 5, kids are using a wide variety of complex sentences. Grammar may not be totally accurate, but it is certainly complex. They can share experiences. You can engage them in conversations. And they're fully intelligible, but that doesn't mean they don't have errors in speech. Most of them do, up to age 8. Typical sounds that they struggle with are TH, L, R, and lots of times we get referrals for the lisp, that S that's not quite right. So that's usually what you'll see at this age. All right, challenges we see in this population. So we have difficulties understanding and developing grammar as infants and toddlers, right, in that range. Well, here it is again. We're still having difficulty with understanding of grammar, difficulty using grammar, gaps in our vocabulary development. If you test them, their vocabulary is age appropriate. When you start to dig, it looks like Swiss cheese. There are holes in the vocabulary development, often with words that deal with time and sequence. Those are abstract words. Remember, I was talking about the transition to thinking with language. That requires some abstraction, and those words are abstract and can be difficult. They're also sort of a tip-off that we might have some problems with reading. Children with dyslexia have difficulty learning words that deal with sequence and time. And we will see difficulty with retrieval. So the child knows the word, but they can't come up with the word. And we all have difficulties with retrieval. It's a matter of a degree. And they will have more of that beyond what we would expect in the typical population. So some examples of retrieval is saying food thing for stove, or cooker thing for stove, sweeper for vacuum, bathroom for toilet. I get that one a lot. And a lot of it and thing. They tend to use non-specific words, and it sometimes makes it very difficult to follow what they're saying. All right. So those signs of difficulty thinking with language, we just talked about some of that. Risk factors for reading disability, we talked about that. They have continued problems with articulation, and usually within that 2 to 5 year range, they end up with a diagnosis of apraxia of speech. And apraxia means that they have difficulty imitating and sequencing sounds. And now we are going to, if there are social language problems, now, again, they're becoming more and more obvious. Reduced eye contact, they have some restricted interests maybe, difficulty with transitions. They play with their peers, but they're also okay being alone. So we start to get a bigger flavor of that possible autism component.
Is that where you start to see more parallel play with it?
Well, parallel play is very young. It's around the 2-year range. So if that's still happening at 5, that's a big marker. Parallel play is just a developmental sequence that children go through very young because they don't have the communication skills, you know, to say, hey, let's pretend you're the fireman, I'm the, you know, woman jumping out of the building or whatever. You know, they make up all these scenarios where they can't do that yet. They just don't have that sophistication. So if parallel play is still going on here, that's a big red flag. And there are other reasons for play not to develop. If you don't have good intelligibility, your grammar's poor, then it's hard to connect with your peers, right? And do some of that more sophisticated interaction. So again, you know, we could talk for a day on any one of these slides, but we only have the time that we have. All right, so now direct therapy, beginning at age 2, is an option. For the young 2-year-old that doesn't imitate very well or doesn't get that, and I mean like, you know, 25, 26 months, you may have some difficulty working directly on sound production or grammar, but you can certainly work on comprehension. By 2.5, they should be able to work one-on-one with a therapist. And parent participation remains absolutely essential. The best progress occurs when there is parent participation. And therapy can look different. We always think of it as, you know, you come in once a week and you have a therapy session, but there are lots of different therapy models. It can be an intensive period of therapy. Sometimes children come in, we see them every day for 2 or 3 weeks to get something going, and then go back to once a week. It can be every other week because they need time to work on a particular skill and solidify it. So lots and lots of different options in that domain. And again, your therapist will be your guide to that. All right, so the school-age child, this is really a period of significant growth in complex language development and thinking skills that continues through adolescence, and in some areas it continues for the rest of our lives. Written language is something I still work on. I work on it all the time. Every time I write a report, I you know, read what I've written, and sometimes I'm not very pleased with it. So there's certain things that continue, but by the end of high school, you know, these kids are, right, their language skills are really solid. Children with X and Y variation, so we're gonna, before I go on, by 3rd to 4th grade, 1st grade, 2nd grade, we're still seeing some transitioning to abstract reasoning and that more complex grammar and formulation skills, but by 3rd or 4th grade, if that is not online, that child's in trouble. They're going to be in trouble. So by then it should all be pretty much age appropriate. So the next couple of slides, I varied that from what I did before, where I told you what the typical development was and then the problems that we see in X and Y, because in these next 2 slides there can be anything that is typical in development can be a problem for the child with X and Y. It really comes to a head in the school age years. So just reverse this to a negative. All right, so you should be able to use complex grammar to express complex thoughts, and we do see difficulty in that in our XY population. Able to switch between formal grammar that you might need in the classroom or for written language, and that includes using words like nevertheless or otherwise, words that we don't really use socially or just when we're chatting, even in a classroom discussion, but you certainly need it for a formal presentation to your class or for your written language. They can produce really logical, easy to follow communication, and they now have a pretty good understanding and ability to apply the rules of social conversation. They know how to start a conversation, how to maintain a topic, how to switch topics, how to honor the interests of others. In our population, we see, what I see is monologuing. They're conversational to a degree as long as I'm talking about what they're interested in. But if I switch it to something that they're not so interested in, then I get, sure, and then right back to the topic that they're interested in, that happens. And matching how they talk and interact to the listener. So you're going to talk to me as the therapist that's testing them a little differently than you're going to talk to your buddy, right? And sometimes they have difficulty distinguishing that kind of switch or shift. All right, understanding abstract language. So we're going to look at 3 things. Figurative language, which includes slang and sarcasm. Inferencing, the ability to read in between the lines when you're talking with someone what they're really saying, even though they're not saying it. And words or sentences that can have more than one meaning. Understanding and ability to track longer streams of language. These 4 things, the figurative language, the inferencing, the alternative meanings, and the ability to track longer language, we have pretty good research that those are absolutely critical to academic success and vocational success. Now, when you think of school, this is all that school is. Reading books, whether they're even little chapter books, you have to be able to track these long streams of language. And figurative language is a big part of teacher discourse, peer discourse, and it's part of the academic curriculum. So you're in trouble if that's a weakness for you. And a good understanding of time, and I put that in there because what I find is, excuse me, allergies, it's the time of year, that sometimes the children can recite the days of the week and the seasons and the months of the year, but they really don't have an internal understanding of time. They just don't. And you can kind of figure that out a little bit. I'll give them little problems to solve with time. And they can't do it, or they'll say things that are like, what's a minute? Or, no, let me come up with a better one. Sometimes I'll say, so an hour, is that as long as a commercial? Or is that as long as a TV show that they've identified that they like? And they'll say, well, it's as long as the commercial, I think, I'm not sure. They get confused really easily. Well, that's a problem because school requires you to organize yourself along a timeline. And there's lots of time, vocabulary and history and social studies and other kinds of things. And so it gives me a window that maybe we need to just dig deeper and maybe do some specific teaching on time.
Is there a therapy for that particular?
There's a program. It's coming up, so I'll let you know. But I recently had a 7-year-old, really sharp kid, and I've been seeing him for articulation problems, very apraxic. And something came up about birthday, and he was talking about like he had 8 birthdays. And I all of a sudden realized that he had no idea, really, that you have 1 birthday a year, what a year was. And so just started using a time series and talking about yesterday, tomorrow, and breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and all those kinds of things. And within 2 months, because his parents got him a calendar, and they're marking off all the days and all the things that you do to teach time, he was a different kid, because one of the other problems that I was struggling with was that he couldn't tell me anything about anything. He would have these fabulous experiences, and he couldn't organize a retelling. I realized that part of that was because he wasn't putting it in a time framework. These experiences were just all floating around in his head, but as soon as he was able to organize them, last month, last week, yesterday, last night. It was amazing what a difference that made in his verbal language. So I always look at time and try to mess around with it a little bit and experiment and try to see if they really do understand time, that they just haven't memorized, you know, the standard kinds of curriculum things that they're asked to learn. All right, so beyond all of this, we can still see in the school-age child errors in what I call basic grammar, pronoun confusions, they're leaving out, they're helping verbs, is, am, are, those kinds of things may still be there. Still seeing retrieval difficulty, and still seeing articulation errors. Now, the articulation errors that we see in the school-age child could still be a leftover from apraxia, but sometimes they demonstrate these random errors that are more due to dyslexia. And I'll give you an example. So I got a call from a dad beside himself that his son had these errors and he had been dismissed from speech and he didn't know what to do. And so he brought him to me, and sure enough, he had these random errors, and I'm going to tell you what one of the errors was. It was mitten for minute. So he would say, I'll be back in a mitten. My dad's going to be here in a mitten. He was severely dyslexic, and he just couldn't retrieve minute. Mitten, minute, kind of close, right? And so the way to do that is not through articulation therapy, it's through habituation. So doing things like, I'll see you in a, and he has to say minute. I'll only be a minute, you know, that kind of thing. So that word pops up instead of mitten. And I did do that for him, and then he called his dad to say, I'm done. And he said he's going to be here in a mitten. So it was obviously going to take more than what I could do during an evaluation. But it is something to think about, that these errors that the kids are producing are not really articulation-based, they're retrieval-based. All right? So I'm going to show you an example. This is an example of a youngster I worked with recently that has really severe retrieval. So you see all these pauses. What do you call it? That thing, you know, pause, pause. He's giving me an example. You celebrate it with turkeys and stuff. That other holiday, pause, Now he comes up with chicken, then he goes back to Turkey Day. He could never get to Thanksgiving. He just could not retrieve it. And actually this evaluation with this youngster, I didn't get through all the testing. I just didn't have the heart, because every answer was like this. He had such severe, severe difficulty coming up with specific vocabulary to express himself.
Was he an XY variant?
No. But I see the same thing.
Okay.
But I just happened to see him, and when they asked me to do this talk, it's like, well, this is perfect, you know. But it's the same. I promise you, a retrieval's retrieval. You know, it's no different for XY or another child with another kind of language disorder. All right, so for the school-age child, there are other things that are also compounding the whole language learning trajectory. ADHD. If you're not attentive, you're not learning. So sometimes we'll see early on that they have gaps in their literacy development because they're not available for instruction. The teacher's instructing and they're, you know, thinking about something else or fiddling with, you know, the child's hair in front of them or something like that. So they're not getting it. Anxiety, which we know is big in this population. When you're anxious, it's really hard to be an active listener. Right? Then we have the dyslexia. Dyslexia can affect your language learning. After about 3rd grade, a lot of the vocabulary and sophisticated grammar that we're exposed to comes through reading. And if you can't read, that's a problem. Now, sometimes we'll say, well, let's do books on tape. Okay, books on tape, except ADHD. Can you listen to that book on tape? Probably not. Probably going to be in and out. So we get into some really complicated barriers that we have to get through to optimize our language learning. Working memory is a problem. Everything in school is working memory, and working memory refers to the ability to hold information in your head while you're manipulating it. So multiple directions, math problems with lots of steps to them, you have to hold in your head what you're supposed to be doing. And so that can also inhibit language learning, so you get more of that Swiss cheese look. Another thing we see in this population and other populations as well, it's not just germane to this population, but particularly in children with autism, the autism diagnosis, is online application. So what I mean by that is they can do it in a test. They look really good on the test. But when you talk to mom and dad or the teacher, they're not taking that skill and applying it. They can just do it in the test. But when, in real life, for example, interpreting figurative language, people just talk. They just talk. The teacher just lectures. She doesn't wait for you to figure it out, right? But in a testing situation, you can think about it. There's multiple choices. You know, there's sort of cues to help you. But in day-to-day living, that's not how it goes. If you have a working memory problem, you're having trouble integrating language from sentence to sentence, you might be able to do it in a testing situation, but not when the teacher's lecturing or the class is having a class discussion. It's going too fast.
So auditory processing fits in right about there?
Everything has to be processed. And auditory processing is something that you need to determine in the context of a learning eval, a language eval, and a cognitive eval, because there are lots of things in the language learning and literacy learning domain that overlap with auditory processing disorder. You cannot test for it if you have unmedicated or uncontrolled ADHD. It requires too much active listening. So that becomes a very, very difficult diagnosis to tease out. I don't know if that answered it, but yeah, it is. It's all processing.
Something to do with what you were talking about, the working memory.
Well, working memory is its own skill set. So even if you didn't have auditory processing problems, you could have working memory problems. It's not because of that. It's its own area of cognitive development. All right, so we better keep going. So in the school-age child, what do we do when their communication problems persist? You know, well, we look for barriers. You know, you have to look for barriers. Is the attention still an issue? Are they not motivated? Goals aren't meaningful. Is there a lot of performance anxiety? What else is going on here that might be interfering with optimum language progress? But the other issue here, particularly when you get into middle school and high school, is I think we just have to honor that this may be a problem they're going to be dealing with for life. All right? So then traditional therapy, you really have to sit down and have a really heart-to-heart, honest conversation. Is that really productive to continue to work on figurative language, or do we need to move to compensatory tools and strategies? We all do workarounds, everybody. I do workarounds. I have some kind of fine motor deficit that if in my younger years, if there had been OT, I'm sure I would have been in therapy. I can't type. I cannot remember where the keys are. I'm very ineffective. So I dictate. That's my workaround. So we have to find workarounds for the kids as well. So we're going to just talk about a few strategies. So the child has difficulty following classroom lectures. because they have problems with attention, anxiety, comprehension. So a great strategy is to preview the material before it's introduced in the classroom. And that means you do a little Google search for Civil War, 10 minutes, get the gestalt of it, North, South, Lincoln, Sherman, Lee, so that they have a construct to follow when they go into that classroom. So if they stop listening for a few minutes or they didn't understand some of it, they can still stay engaged because they have the gestalt. And these are kids that I say sometimes, like with comprehension problems, you don't have to get an A. Happy with a C. I just want you to get the facts. So we just have to work with it, you know, and we have to help the child work with it while preserving their ego and their motivation to stay in the academic game, because it's hard. All right, struggles to follow movies, books, you know, that are really popular, like Harry Potter. Well, we're going to give them a short summary and a review. Easy to do. We have computers. Any book, you can get a review of the book. Movies, the same thing, so that they have an idea. Then they can go to the movie and watch it and sort of talk about it with their friends. Their friends may be talking about it at a deeper level, but they're not going to notice that that child isn't, because their commentary and their reflections on the movie are keeping them in the game again. All right, trouble with word retrieval. This one's a little more difficult. But permission from the teacher to use key vocabulary, a list of vocabulary for essay tests, or that they can use in the class discussion so they can reference it. And sometimes what we have to do is they just have to do more practice with that vocabulary. And I do that. Like when I give a talk, I have to sort of go over, you know, this is the word I want to use. And so they may have to do some more just rapid naming practice so that those words stay in their memory bank. But a list of key vocabulary, why not? What's the harm? Another one, they don't understand time. We talked about that. You can use all of these compensations, and I actually misled you. There is a time series by James, I have to write it. I think it's Lattyake. You can Google it and you can buy them. I like the first two. The last one is on seasons and it's horrible. It's all about holidays, but the last like 10 pages are on seasons, and they're really good. They're really good, but, you know, but the rest of that particular book is not too hot, but I really do like it. Yeah?
What about like bilingual English for kids with speech problems? Is that encouraged or discouraged? I've read like mixed opinions about what? About bilingual.
The standard thinking is both languages, but I think I don't like to have all fits one, all sizes fit rules, okay? There may be a reason. Like if I have a child with a severe articulation problem, you know, that I'm really working hard to get functional words in one language, then I have to think about, can I do two languages? If it's taking me so much effort just to get, you know, whatever I'm getting. So I think at some point you do have to use your clinical judgment or your, you know, look at the child and say what's best for him or her, you know. So, but the rule is that they should be equally adept in both. Yeah. Yes?
Knowing all of this information and needs that kids will have, what is the best school setting if a person have a choice of which school setting to choose, like Montessori or public schools with special education or Waldorf? Like, is there any
I think the best setting is the setting that gives you tools and strategies and is willing to support that. There was someone in this room before that was talking about a child's written language problems, dysgraphia. And I cannot tell you how many times I'm saying, why isn't this child on a computer? Why are we still working on handwriting? If it's that hard, you know, we have technology. Let's use the technology. Use the technology. I have terrible handwriting, terrible. I cannot tell you the hours I spend over, you know, after school writing. I still can't write. I mean, when I do a note, I work, you know, to make it legible. I still sometimes get calls. It's a lovely note. What does it say? Because it's just, you know, awful. And I use, you know, dictation, use my mic on my phone, everything. I don't text. I say it into the phone. There's lots of technology. We just have to find something that will work and then persuade you know, the school to use it. So let's get through this and then we'll have some more time. But one more, figurative language. Figurative language, you can have a child in figurative language for the rest of their life. Because figurative language is a moving target. It changes daily. We are the slang, sarcasm nation of the world. We just revel in that. We use so much of that. And so what I advise is to sort of make sure you keep up with the slang that's going on with the peers, and that if your child has trouble with it, you teach it to them. Just tell them what it means. Because you're never going to be able to resolve that if that's an area of challenge for them. So, you know. And actually working on inferencing is a good way to work on figurative language, because you have to infer that meaning. But for some kids, both of those are weaknesses, so just work on it. Tell them what it means so they can use it appropriately with their peers and they understand what's being said. And it's troublesome for all of us, isn't it? And it is for me. A couple of years ago, I don't know how many of you follow football, but the quarterback for the Carolina Panthers, Cam Newton, was dabbing. Oh, it was all over the media. I had to look it up. What the heck is that, you know? Who knows? You know, yeah, that's right. I learned that. Okay. So, you know, it comes up all the time. Had a little girl a couple years ago, working with her, and she looked up and she said, "You're so fly." And I assumed that was positive. Good for me. I'm so fly. But I hadn't heard that before, you know, but I'm not in middle school, right? It's all, and if you watch late night TV, you can hear all kinds of these slang expressions and the sarcastic expressions and all of that, and some of our kids have trouble with it. And what I say is, don't try to work on all the expressions, just work on what's going on in the peer group, what's going on in their culture, and teach them that, and they will do well. And then you can use Google Drive to set up files so they don't lose homework and things like that. So bottom line, use technology. Reference your educational staff that know the technology. So our augmentative specialists here in this hospital, I refer to them. They know about predictive written language programs. They have so much expertise because that is their world. That's what they do all day long. I don't. So, you know, you have to find that person that has that expertise and say, this is what I'm struggling with. What do you think? What's out there that we could use? Because it's really hard, you know, you as a sole person to keep up with it all. We really have to see if we can find some specialists. All right, so questions? Yes?
How often do you see kids with Klinefelter's or other XY disorders that have stuttering issues?
You know, the stuttering can be neurogenic. You know, it's a kind of a neurogenic stuttering. But oftentimes I find that they're characterized, like on the phone, as stuttering, but when I get them, it's really word retrieval. No, it's not a stutter. They're using it as a place marker to try and get to the next word or the next grammatic structure that they're not so sure about. But, you know, I don't have good data on that. But in the ones that I've seen, it's not the first thing that I would be looking for. But again, we can, you know, have them evaluated by a fluency specialist. And they will look at formulation and word retrieval because they get, you know, it goes hand in hand with some of the disfluency. They can be separate, but they also can be layered on each other, and let them see if they can tease it out. But I have to say, of course, you know, I haven't seen hundreds of these children. It's still a fairly small sample, even though I've done it for quite a few years, and that is not something I see as frequently. But you know, whenever there's a problem, there's always the chance of another problem coming on top. So it could be. Yeah.
So you had mentioned if they're over third or fourth grade and they're
Yeah.
having trouble to work on the
The
compensation.
compensations,
Do you still suggest getting the eval and seeing any specific short-term strategies?
Oh yeah, get the evaluation because, you know, testing might be able to weed out, you know, not weed out, define more specifically what the issues are. But again, I think this is where that multidisciplinary evaluation comes through that is possible in the extraordinary.
Question, what kind of eval do you get? Because I've got this problem with language, immersion, and speech.
But you know what, for the school-age child, language is one slice. Then you need the literacy piece, then you need the psychological cognitive piece, the emotional piece. It's like one big circle. Yeah, you don't just have this problem. This problem is layered on top of anxiety and other things. So you have to have that big picture so you know where to put the energy. Sometimes it's not in speech, it's in reducing the anxiety.
Well, what is that big picture? Is that a psychoeducational evaluation?
It's a multidisciplinary eval.
That's not the norm unless there's a center.
It's not, you can get it at school, they can do a learning eval, a speech eval, and a cognitive eval. The problem that I find with schools is they don't integrate it. So they're all these standalone evals, you know, and I read them and it's like, well, just draw as many arrows as you want, you know, because it's going back and forth. There's issues that are complicating everything. And here you can get that through the X and Y clinic. There are some other clinics, but you somehow have to find that piece. You can't just look at the language alone. It doesn't stand alone. Yes?
How early can apraxia be diagnosed? Like at what age should my speech therapist be really looking at that?
That's a tough one. There's a lot of controversy about what exactly the behavioral characteristics are of apraxia. I think sometimes you know, somewhere in the 2-year range. It depends on how much they're producing, you know, what they can do. But if you see imitation problems, sequencing problems, for me, I get this question a lot, and I get families that are distressed because the diagnosis of apraxia hasn't been given. For me, it's less about the diagnosis and more about the treatment. If the treatment is multisensory, visual, auditory, sign cue, gesture cue, high levels of repetitive practice, that's what I care about. What you want to call it,